All right, so why do we like to tell stories? Because they're fun, they're entertaining. Absolutely. What are some other reasons why we tell stories? What do you think, Emma? To honor people? Yeah. Like, the guy who did this, or yeah, absolutely. Memorialize. What else? To inform people about whatever. Okay. Like, did you hear that? Da 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 da. Yeah, absolutely. What else? Absolutely. Pass down the traditions. Absolutely. Why else do people tell stories?
Educate.
Okay. Yeah. How about let's see. What is a good story? What's the tortoise and the hare? What's the purpose of that story? What are we educating them about? Do you know the story of the tortoise and the hare?
Go by your own state.
The rabbit boasts that he can outrun the tortoise, and the tortoise is like, I got you. Okay. So they have a race, right? And the rabbit's in the lead, or the hare, and he's like, you know what? I got this. I'm just gonna take a nap. Meanwhile, the tortoise is like 5 miles behind him, But he's going. And then he passes the hare while the hare is sleeping. And the tortoise is almost at the finish line when the hare wakes up and realizes that he's behind. And so he tries his darndest to get to the finish line, but he doesn't because the tortoise finished before him because he didn't stop. So what kind of lesson is that? What do we say?
To keep going.
Right. That's the moral of the story, right? Is don't give up, keep trying. And yeah, you might be able to finish before who you think should win. So what about the hare? What should the hare learn?
The hare should learn to yeah.
So what was his attitude?
His attitude was just like, I'm gonna beat you, slow turtle.
His ego was bigger, than his actual head. So the moral of the story is to keep pushing forward and watch the attitude. It's called an Aesop fable. All right. So just want to point that out because that might be relevant here. All right. So if you'll take your digital history and go to the second page where it says stories told by slaves, we're going to see what kinds of stories they told. And these are just a few, of course, but they have like some of them have a reoccurring character. And his name was High John the Conqueror. And he was known as a trickster because he got the best of his master a lot of the times. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. All right. So I'm going to read these two stories and some others, and I'm going to have a storyteller I found on YouTube tell another one. And again, these are all High John the Conqueror stories. And there's a reason behind them. All right. Have you ever heard of Briar Rabbit or Briar Fox? Yeah, you have? Yeah. So they are also tricksters and prominent characters within even African cultures that came over to the United States when slaves came over. All right, so they're very similar in nature. So let's look at Possum. You can read along with me. It says, Old Massa loved roasted young pigs and had them often for dinner. Old John loved them too, but Massa never allowed the slaves to eat any at all. John got tired of that. Though he took to stopping by the pig pen when he had a strong taste for pig meat and getting himself one and taking it on down to his cabin and cooking it. Massa began to miss his pigs and made up his mind to see who was taking them. John keeps taking pigs, and one night Massa walked him down and saw John kill the pig. Massa went back to the big house and waited till he figured John had it dressed and cooking. Then he went on down to the quarters and knocked on John's door. What are the quarters? What's that refer to? Yeah, so all the houses or shacks where they slept. So Massa knocked on John's door. Who's that? John called out big and bold. It's me, John, Massa told him. I want to come in. No, Massa, you don't want to come into this old slave cabin. You're too fine a man for that. I tell you, I want to come in, John. So John had to open the door and let Massa in. John had seasoned that pig down, and it was stinking pretty. John knowed old Massa couldn't help but smell it. Massa talked on about crops and hound dogs and one thing and another, and the pot with the pig in it was hanging over the fire in the chimney and kicking up. The smell got better and better. Way after a while, Massa said, John, what's cooking in that pot? Nothing but a little Weasley possum, Massa. Get a plate and give me some of it, John. I'm hungry. Oh, no, Massa. You ain't hungry. Now, John, I don't mean to argue with you 1 minute. You give me some of that in the pot, or I mean to have the hide of your back tomorrow morning. Give it to me. So John got up and went to the pot. He lifted the lid and looked at Massa and told him, well, Massa, I put this thing ain't here a possum, but it come out a pig. It ain't no fault of mine. Old Massa didn't want to laugh, but he did before he caught himself. He took the plate of brown pig and ate it. He never said nothing, but he gave John and all the other house servants roast pig at the big house after that. All right. So what's the moral of the story here? What do you think? That's what happened, but the moral of, like, what's the lesson behind this particular story? Why would slaves tell this story?
Oh, because he got aborted.
For what?
For telling the truth.
Cooking the pig.
Oh, he didn't tell the truth, did he?
Or no, for
Cooking the pig.
Yeah. So he got rewarded for making the master do what? Laugh. Exactly. Okay. So the moral of the story is maybe if you can benefit if you make the master happy or make him laugh, something like that. Okay. So that's one such story. Here's another one. It's called mellitus. Now, when you hear the word itis at the end of a word, what does that generally indicate? Sickness, some type of sickness. Exactly. All right. So it says the following story is based on one of the recordings of former slaves made during the 1930s. Like the High John story, it is about how the slaves tricked the master to get pig meat. So it says this. Some of them slaves was so poorly thin, they would kind of rustle against each other like corn stalks a-drying in the hot winds. They got one hog killing time, and it was funny too. There was 7 hogs, fat and ready to fall hog killing time. Just the day before old master told off they was to be killed, something happened to all them porkers. One of the field boys found them and come a-telling the master. The hogs all died. Now there won't be any meats for the winter. When the master gets to where the hogs is laying, there's a lot of Negroes standing around sorrow-eyed at the wasted meat. And the master asks, what's the illness with them? Mellitus, they tells them, and they acts like they don't want to touch the hogs. Master says to dress them anyway, for they ain't any more meat on the place. He says to keep all the meat for the slave families, but that's because he is afraid to eat it himself account of the hogs got mellitus. Now the master never knew that long before the rising horn called the slaves from their cabins, one of the strongest Negroes got up. He skidded down to the hog pen with a heavy mallet in his hand. When he tapped Mr. Hog between the eyes with the mallet, mellitus set in pretty quick. But it was an uncommon disease, even with hungry Negroes around all the time. So what's the disease?
Mellitus.
It's mellitus, but how do you get it? How'd the hogs get it? They got concussed, yeah. With what? A mallet, yeah. So what does this particular story say about the relationship between the slaves and the master? Absolutely. Who trusts who? The master trusts the slaves because he believed what the slaves said. Okay. And the slaves knew it. So what'd they do? They told them what? Yeah, they told them a lie. Okay. But how did that benefit them? Yeah, they got to eat. So, and the very first sentence talks about their condition. Says they were so poorly thin they would kind of rustle against each other like corn stalks a drying in the wind. I don't know if you've heard that sound before, but I can hear it in my head. So very, very thin. So they're finding ways to be able to feed themselves, even if it's lying and tricking the master. So I like that one. That's pretty good. Okay. So I'm going to let another person, a more authentic person, tell a story about High John. And he's better at it than I am. So take a look at, here we go. This one. This is called High John and the Christmas Turkey.
The story I'm going to tell you, since I talked about this character, is a story of High John the Conqueror. Now, I heard this story in 1992 from a storyteller from Santa Barbara, Oconee the Storyman, who has since passed away. And he was my introduction to the High John stories. And this is my favorite. There are many High John stories, but this is the one that I love to tell. It's called High John and the Christmas Turkey. Now, they used to say of High John, he wouldn't pick cotton, he wouldn't bale hay, he wouldn't take a beating, but he wouldn't run away. You see, John was a trickster, and he was usually tricking old Massa. Now, every year at Christmas, John had a task to prepare the Christmas turkey for old Massa and his family. Now, you can be sure that most of that turkey would find its way into John's belly, and old Massa and his family, they'd be eating possum. Well, Master got tired of always being tricked by John, so he decided he was going to play a trick on him. So he calls him to him that day before Christmas and says, John, yes, sir, Master, you going to make that Christmas turkey? Oh, yeah, Master, I'm going to make that. I'm going to cook that turkey. Oh, yeah. Well, John, we're doing something different this year. Whatever you do to that turkey, we going to do to you. Uh-oh, thought John. If I pluck that turkey's feathers, he'll skin me alive. And if I chop off that turkey's head, ultimate haircut. But John was quick of wit, came up with a plan. Christmas Day, old Master and his family, they all in on this joke on John. They all sitting out on the porch when John comes down the road with that turkey, feathers and head intact. Master says, John, yes, sir, Master. Remember what I told you? Yes, sir, Master. Let me see if I got this here right. Whatever I do to this here turkey, all y'all gonna do to me. That's right, John. What you gonna do? Well, Master, I'm gonna show you. John took that turkey and picked it up. Set it up on the porch. Set that turkey right up on the porch. Raised that turkey's tail feathers and kissed it smack dab in the butt. Then he turned to old Master and his family, flipped up his coattails. He got dressed up for this. He says, y'all take your time now. I ain't going nowhere. And that's the end of that.
It's a good one.
That was, oh my God.
It's a good one. So what'd you think was going to happen?
He just wasn't going to do anything with the turkey. But
I thought it was going to put it at the table, like sitting up.
Sitting up at the table?
Yeah.
Like part of the table? Like, okay. What else? What do you think?
I thought he was going to make his turkey food so that he could eat food too.
A lot of people think, oh, he's going to free the turkey. So they'd free High John. But he didn't.
Well, he
Which
didn't
is really
want to go
interesting.
anywhere.
It's true. It's true. So anyway, so why tell these particular stories? They certainly aren't. Slaves aren't certainly telling these stories to the white folk. So why are slaves telling these stories to each other? Yes, I think there's a moral to the story in some cases, but ultimately, what's it for?
Humor.
For humor. Okay. Anything else? Definitely humor, for sure.
maybe telling that their masters can be pretty dumb sometimes.
Oh yeah, sure. I think that's part of it too. But in that sense, what does it say about the slaves themselves?
They're cunning.
They're cunning. Yeah, so sometimes when we say Oh, they're tricky versus cunning. What's the difference there? Is there a difference? Like what does cunning mean, Caleb?
I don't know exactly, but I feel like it's more like it's a little bit of tricky, but you're more smart than just normal.
Yes. Yes. So in a sense, one, the masters are pretty dumb to fall for these tricks, but also on the other hand, the slaves are extremely cunning and smart to help themselves because they're being so, oppressed. So, so that's the reason I think they're telling stories as well as for entertainment. I mean, because what else are they doing for entertainment? Besides singing songs to express their emotions about their situation. Um, Not much in the form of entertainment. So I found a book on Amazon, The Adventures of High John the Conqueror, and I found some more stories if you would like to hear them. Some of them are pretty good. Okay, so this is called Off Limits. No. Whenever Old Master was feeling mean or angry or both, which was pretty often, he would take it out on the slaves. That might mean a beating for anyone unfortunate enough to catch his eye. Or he might order the overseer to keep them working in the fields late into the night under the light of the full moon. Or worst of all, he might hold back on the meager rations given to the slaves, making their lives even more of a misery than they already were. Sometimes, though, he could just be plain pettifogging. And I've never heard that word. I'm assuming it's really, really mean. Like the time he announced that the catfish in the big pond were off limits to everyone except himself. From now on, he said he was the only one who could catch them. The slaves were still allowed to fish the pond once they'd completed their work or on Sundays when they weren't expected to labor. But if they hooked a catfish, they had better throw it right back in the water where it came from. Otherwise, they'd be severely punished. Oh, they were free to keep any other fish they caught, which was all well and good, except for the only other fish that lived in the pond were tiny perch, not bigger than a baby's hand. They were so small and so filled with bones like needles that they hardly seemed worth the trouble it took to clean and cook them. After Master laid down his new law, John was the only one who kept right on fishing. Every Sunday he'd amble on down in the pond, set himself in the warm shade of the oaks and willows, and try his luck. When the others asked him why he bothered, he'd smile that big smile of his and say, "Oh, I just love them little perch. For me, they're sweet as sugar on the tongue." Truth was that John didn't like the perch any more than anyone else, but he certainly did like catfish, and it was catfish he was fishing for. He was bold enough to keep each and every one he pulled from the pond, and he was cagey enough to get them into his frying pan without anyone, including Master, seeing him do it. Late one easy Sunday afternoon, John had fallen asleep in the long, dappled shadows and was dreaming his favorite dream about lying down and getting up when he wanted to, not when someone else thought he should. John was dreaming about freedom. Just then, who should come walking by the pond but Old Master himself? He saw John napping, his pole in the water, a bunch of tiny perch in his bucket, and there, hanging on a string tied to the branch of a willow, a fat 8-pound catfish. He'd caught John just as sure as John had caught that catfish, no doubt about it. He shook John awake, and the minute John opened his eyes and ears, he didn't have any doubt about it either. "Nice day," said Master, staring directly at that yellow and gray catfish gleaming in the sun. "How's the fishing today?" John knew he was in the middle of a serious devilment, and he was scared, but he had learned long ago that being scared didn't do anyone any good whatsoever, unless that anyone was going to do something about it. He immediately began scrambling in his mind, thinking so hard you could almost hear the wheels spinning inside his head. Meanwhile, Master was delighting in the situation and wanted to take as much pleasure from it as he could. He wanted to see John twist and turn just like a fish might do when it got itself hooked. "I asked you, John," he said slowly, "how's the fishing today?" And that minute of playing with John was Master's mistake, because that was all the time John needed. "You know, Massa," he said, "I've been having a terrible time today, a terrible time. Everything started out just fine. The perch were biting good. I had half a bucket before I was even settled in, and then this catfish heard I was here and began stealing my bait. I asked him to stop, but he kept right on taking it. Why, he wouldn't quit even when I ordered him to. Finally, I had to catch him, massa, or he would have stolen it all. But I'm done fishing now, so I guess I might as well turn him loose. So John untied the catfish and threw it back into the water, where, with a single splash of its tail, dove straight to the bottom of the pond. He picked up his pole and his bucket and started on home, leaving old master standing alone on the bank, staring at the ripples the catfish made, growing wider and wider and wider. It's pretty good.
I don't know how I feel about that.
Well, how do you feel now?
That's
Would the
hilarious.
catfish be like a surprisingly good one?
He's really good at jokes.
How?
Yeah.
That doesn't make sense. Because if you're
I didn't
sinking
like that
that
one.
and
Like
the
it sounds
catfish
like
was on a
10
line,
catfish.
it would be
Could be like
dead.
Yeah.
It's a story.
Okay.
The catfish would
I mean, just
It depends on how long the catfish
I wonder
is.
how
reason
the master
catfish
felt.
can be pretty
Yeah.
good.
Oh, I bet the master was ticked, but could he do anything about it? I mean, he didn't keep
If you
it.
have like some no-slip gloves, you use a catfish as like a club. That's all I can do now.
Okay, let's see.
I wonder what the
That's
punishment
not
was.
He didn't get punished for that, right?
Yeah,
It's
no,
already
it's
dead.
it's fine.
There is one particular story that he does get punished, actually, because, and I was looking for the explanation.
Why is there a catfish on the ground? Are you like medieval?
Yeah, you're
Let's
like
see here, I gotta
in a
find it.
swamp, and you're finding a knife. So you just grab it.
Oh, okay, here we go.
Dent his helmet with that.
You like the notches on everything?
All right.
Yeah. You
All right, I need you to. I need to read a little bit of information before this next story. Some of it you already know, but some of you may not. I can't remember if I told you about this earlier. It said basically there are two kinds of slaves: the field hands and house slaves. The field hands did most of the hard physical labor on the plantation. They plowed the fields, grew the crops, chopped the wood, maintained the roads, and did just about everything else that could weary the bones. House slaves, on the other hand, had a much easier time of it. They worked in the big house, cooking, cleaning, polishing, and do whatever made old master and his family more comfortable. Their labor was clearly different, and generally so were their attitudes. There were even some house slaves who felt closer to their white masters than to their brothers and sisters in common bondage. For example, if their owner came down with an illness, they could be heard to say, "Oh, massa, we're sure feeling sick today, ain't we?" Or if there was some calamity like the barn burning down, they might say, "Oh, ain't it awful that our barn burned down?" Worse still, there were times when some of them, for their own benefit, would inform on the other slaves. So that's not uncommon. So this particular story, George is a house slave and John is a field slave. But although George ate pretty well up in the big house, there were times when he didn't quite fill his belly and, like the field hands, was forced to use his own ingenuity to get enough to eat. Early one evening, he caught himself a possum and took it on back to his cabin. He set it in a large iron skillet and put coals on the bottom and coals on the top. Then he set potatoes around it and left it to roast all nice and brown. Once it was cooking away, George lay down on his cot and went to sleep. By the time he woke, his lovely dinner would be ready to eat. Now, who should come walking by George's cabin but High John himself? Though he wanted nothing to do with George after their last run-in, which is where John was almost whipped to death, he had no intention of stopping. John couldn't help but smell that possum cooking on the coals, though. That sure does smell good. Why, it smells good enough to eat. I think I'll just stop and say hello to my friend George. John called out, but George, who was wrapped deeply in his dream about all those victuals, never even heard him. So John peeked in the cabin and saw George sleeping. He also saw the skillet, and it didn't take a lot of imagination to guess what was in it. Very quietly, John tiptoed up to that frying pan, whereupon he proceeded to feast upon its contents. He ate everything except for half of one possum leg and a tiny piece of potato. Then he put the possum leg in George's left hand and the potato in his right and went out as silently as he had come in. Not long after, George woke from his nap in his dream, thinking about the feast he was about to partake of. Then he noticed that he was holding a bit of possum and a bit of potato. "Gracious me," he said, "I must have eaten that whole possum already." A few bites and what was left was gone. George sat on the edge of his cot for a few minutes, thinking hard. Then he said, "Yep, I must have eaten it all, but if I did eat that possum and all the taters, they're laying on my stomach lighter than any meal I've ever had before." John had done it again, and this time George never even suspected. So the previous story, George tricks John into doing something and gets whipped to death, almost to death for it. So it's kind of payback in a sense. Okay. All right.
It's kind of evil.
It's like
Kind of evil? Yeah.
best in
It's hard.
possum.
Anybody ever had possum before? You have?
This plantation's just like infested.
Not
Is it
that
good?
bad.
Not too bad? Hey, when you're starving.
It tastes kind of like rabbit, but
So
like
they make it sound
Yeah.
really cool.
Yeah.
It kinda sounds
They're
like
not
a
being
sleep on
fattened up
plastic,
like
yeah.
cows are.
Seasoning seasoning pig and like this perfectly skinny stuff.
But it isn't bad.
Also, where did the potatoes come into play?
Okay, last story, and it's pretty good. This is called John's Memory. At different times in different places, High John made himself useful in a number of ways. Of course, he only did so if it would get him out of hard labor. On one particular plantation, a very large one, John avoided having to go to the fields by becoming the record keeper. He told old master that keeping all those facts and figures in his head was more than enough work for any man. And further, he said, if I sweat too much, some of those numbers might just come rolling out with the water. John was so skillful at record keeping that master came to depend on him and never asked him to do anything else. One day, though, the devil appeared and said he wanted to take John. "Why do you want him?" master asked. "Well," replied the devil, "it's just his time." "Please, devil, don't take John," pleaded master. "He's too important to me. Take anyone else, but not John." To the devil, a slave was a slave, and one didn't seem very different from another. So he asked master what was so special about John. "I've got so much to do, I don't have time to keep books or records, but John's memory is so good, he keeps it all in his head. If I want to know anything about last year's crops, all I have to do is ask John, and he can tell me exactly how many bales of cotton we harvested or how many bushels of corn we got. If I want to know how much seed we bought 2 years ago, John can tell me just like that." "Well, in all my travels, I've never heard the like of it before," said the devil. "I'll tell you what, I'll test John's memory, and if it's as good as you say it is, I'll spare him. But if it's not, I'll have to take him." "Fair enough," said master. So the devil went and found High John. He was napping in the shade of a weeping willow tree with his hat covering his face. What John liked to do best was nothing, and to do it slowly, and this was his favorite way to pass an afternoon. The devil gave him a kick to wake him, but John didn't even bother to take off the hat off his face to see who it was. He just mumbled, "What do you want?" "I want to know," said the devil, "if you like eggs." That I do," said John, and immediately the devil disappeared. Master was certainly relieved to see John that evening. He figured John had passed the devil's test, and that was the end of it. But 2 years later, the devil returned. It was a hot summer day, one of those days when even the insects seemed to slow down to an amble, and John was sleeping in the shade of the willow tree just like the last time. And the devil kicked John awake, and again John continued to lie there with his hat over his face. This time the devil said only one word. "How?" Without a thought, John answered, "Fried," and the devil vanished. John had truly passed the test, and the devil never came back to bother him again. Good memory. Good memory.
I'd be scared if
I would've
the
been
devil came
like,
to test
what?
me. I'd be more scared if it just came to me and asked a personal question. Do you like eggs?
No wonder
And then
she
how?
said after
If you said no, but it's like,
I would have been like,
Yeah, when she said no.
What are you saying?
Actually, like,
how what?
Say what?
What?
What are you talking about?
I understand.
I've
All
heard
right,
good
so
things
there's
in
High
belief.
John, the Conqueror.
eggs sounds like a common belief. Who likes eggs?
I've heard good things in a day.
I'm not gonna that.
I know, right?
What you really?
Well, I'll tell you, some of the work that they had to do, yeah, it took hard physical labor, but how are you improving your mind at that point? It's not a whole lot.
Just
So they're doing a lot of thinking on their
I
own,
was just gonna go.
independently. So,
Fully open.